Okay, I think we can get started. Alex just asked me in private why not use the everyone tag to notify everyone. And the reason we decided not to do that is we think the everyone, or just constantly calling everyone, causes some fatigue on the importance of notifications. Hence, we no more call it or use it for classes and DAO meetings. Hopefully, there has been some time changes with class, but we will get back and will be in schedule, so that should make it easier and clear for others. When class and DAO meetings take place. Also, to those who are with us and maybe who will listen to this recording later, you can always find the events that are scheduled on the channel list or the menu list at the very top of the Discord server. All right. One more thing. There are two channel discussions for 2 BIPs that are going to be proposed. Those may be familiar with them. So that's the Beanstalk Farms budget and the Seraph BIP. One notable change for the Beanstalk Farms budget is that this time this is for the first half, so it's not a quarterly budget, and would encourage everyone again who is with us today or will be listening to this recording to join the conversation and have any questions and ask them there. There will also be office hours that are listed in the announcement channel. You can know what days that will be there. The team from the BFC will be there and happy to take any questions or answer any questions regarding to the budget or anything else. All right, how are you, Publius?
Doing quite well, Maud. How are you?
Things are well here. Publius, I was thinking that maybe we can spend some time or dedicate this class to talk about the field in depth. And this is something that we've occasionally discussed throughout times and different classes, but maybe we can start from the very beginning and go on. But starting off, maybe what is the purpose of the field? Why does the field exist in Beanstalk?
Beanstalk is a threaded-based system. The value of beans at the end of the day, from a theoretical perspective, are ultimately derived from the credit worthiness of Beanstalk. In practice, what that means is the ability for Beanstalk to dampen the volatility in the price of beans downward is a function of its ability to borrow beans from the market. And Beanstalk borrows beans from the market in the field. So the field is the Beanstalk credit facility, and the purpose of the field is to attract lenders to Beanstalk in the quantity and during the seasons that Beanstalk needs to at a reasonable price. Now, there's a general open question as to the best way for Beanstalk to price the debt or price its pod issuance in practice, which is the temperature. The interest rate for lending or sowing beans to Beanstalk is the temperature. There's probably a lot more optimization and theoretical progress that can be made in terms of how to properly set the temperature in general. But the general purpose of the field is for Beanstalk to borrow beans not as efficiently as possible. This is the comment on the temperature optimization being ambiguous at the moment. It's not to borrow as efficiently as possible because efficient is hard to define at this point. Now, does it mean that Beanstalk should optimize for borrowing as quickly as possible at higher interest rates, or in general, like, for example, right now, there doesn't seem to be much demand to lend to Beanstalk at the current temperature. Now, Beanstalk could, in theory, increase the temperature very quickly until it finds borrowers, but if there's no demand to lend to Beanstalk at any price right now for whatever reason, then whenever the temperature is found where someone is willing to lend to Beanstalk, it may be so high that Beanstalk issues too much debt where now it's unable to find the next marginal lender. And so instead of just optimizing for quickly finding a borrower at any price, Beanstalk currently raises the temperature relatively slowly and is less concerned with immediately finding a borrower in practice than if it were raising the temperature much faster. But then there's an open question as to what is the reasonable amount of time in terms of seasons or time in general, and price action or deviation from the peg that is acceptable to the system, and how should the incentive to lend to Beanstalk change in time relative to it. So there's a lot of open questions in the field in practice, but you asked a general question, so you got a pretty wide-ranging answer. But just to summarize, the purpose of the field is for Beanstalk to borrow beans from the market.
Okay, and yes, we spoke a little bit about the temperature and maybe the details of or how the field functions, but maybe we take it a step back a little bit before diving into these details. So as you said, Beanstalk is a credit-based system. Credit means your ability to borrow, and given that Beanstalk is a stable coin, so it uses its ability to borrow to maintain peg. And this idea or the thought was experimented or done previously in previous iterations. And we want to talk about how the field became the field today. And maybe before that, we can briefly discuss how or what different iterations were done previously with other protocols, maybe on how they wanted to borrow to do the same thing, which is to maintain peg. And we can start maybe with ones that we're running. And we have ESD and DSD, which both of them, they also relied on their ability to borrow to maintain peg. And we saw various results on it. Can Publius, maybe you tell us how did ESD and DSD try to borrow credit, and then from those outcomes, what were the lessons learned, and then how is the field any different?
So I'm not going to make it up, Mod, and I don't remember off the top of my head exactly how they worked, but perhaps we should talk about theoretically the different models that have been proposed. Now, the basic idea for a debt-based currency really started with seigniorage shares, and there were a couple implementations and attempts at implementations like Basis Cash, ESD, DSD, and there were a couple different models that were attempted. I'll try to recall as best as possible. Didn't know we were going to get into the field at all, so didn't do any refreshers on this before. Apologies, but if I recall correctly, Basis, which was based on the seigniorage shares model, had an auction, and they never launched, so it never was tested in the wild. But the concept would be that there would basically there was a Dutch auction on a regular interval, and the system was willing to sell debt at any price. And that model, in theory, would, going back to the open question on temperature optimization, would optimize for selling enough debt all the time to keep a perfect peg, or be able to return the price to its peg at whatever interval that the bond issuance was taking place at any price. And at least from our perspective, that would almost certainly lead to incredibly high debt issuance at certain periods of time that would likely cause runaway debt issuance in the system ultimately to crash. And in addition to that, in addition to the issuance of debt, there's a question as to the redemption of debt. And generally, prior to Beanstalk, the debt issuance was fungible, and so redemption around repayment of the debt was typically subject to some race condition. Now, with ESD and DSD, the debt issuance was a function of the debt level of the system, and so there was some hard-coded interest rate curve that dictated what the interest rate should be somewhat arbitrarily, which led to large inefficiencies in the market. And so that was subject to a different problem on the debt issuance side than the basis model, because whereas basis would overpay for debt issuance, ESD and DSD would issue debt on an arbitrary curve such that there would be long periods of time where there was no demand to lend to the protocol, because the interest rates at which it was willing to offer, it was just unattractive, and there was no protocol native way to adjust to market conditions at all in practice. So that was on the debt issuance side. And then on the redemption side, ESD and DSD, if we recall correctly, were subject to race conditions on chain because the debt issuance was fungible, which led to whales being able to redeem large amounts of debt and smaller players being unable to redeem at all. So it created a really horrible user experience, and it was an unfair market in practice, and that created large inefficiencies because smaller players didn't want to participate. And ultimately, these types of systems are dependent on a large set of users, not just whales. So those were the problems on the debt issuance side and redemption side for the two major models that were previously attempted prior to Beanstalk. And just to now talk about how Beanstalk fits into that context.
And Publius, did they also have an expiry date? So when you had that debt, was there a time where you can redeem it and then it expires?
I think in all cases prior to Beanstalk, there was some expiry on the debt, although don't recall exactly the time periods for any of those protocols. But that's a good point, Matt. They all had expiry on the debt issuance, correct?
Okay, so debt was fungible in the sense that it was all the same as soon as you buy it. Of course, you could have bought it at both different amounts, but there was no sort of, which we're going to come into, that when did you buy it exactly, and then the other point was also the expiry of it, and then maybe.
Well, I guess the expiry would make it such that it wasn't totally fungible, but just in terms of redemption, it was typically fungible. Just to clarify.
Okay. All right, and now we want to talk about how did Beanstalk try to address this, and I guess the two main things that we want to talk about, or is the FIFO system, or the first in and first out, and then the second part is controlling, as you mentioned previously, the way that the the interest rate was measured was dependent on the level of the debt in the system, but now Beanstalk does it differently. Can you maybe tell us a little bit, how does the field address those two things?
Well, in Beanstalk, whenever Beanstalk is trying to borrow beans from the market, it creates soil, and for each soil, anyone that has a bean can lend the beans into the soil, or sow the beans into the soil, one bean to one soil, and they get pods based on the temperature at the time that they sow on a that harvest or become redeemable for a bean on a first in, first out basis. And in practice, because the distribution of new bean mints or bean seigniorage is determined by the code, so the distribution of the the bean seigniorage is known in advance, given that the pods harvest on a first in, first out basis, and at the time that you lend to Beanstalk, you know the place in line, and you know the number of pods that you'll receive. You know at exactly the bean supply at which your pods will become redeemable into beans. And because beans are only minted when the price of a bean is above $1, there is an expectation that when the pods harvest, they will be able to be sold for at least $1 of value. And so, given the price of a bean and the temperature, you know at exactly what bean supply you can expect a return and price that return exactly. And the interesting thing here is that ultimately the previous bond models that the other protocols attempted were copies of current debt implementations in traditional finance, because you would never go to a bank or a lender, or excuse me, to a borrower and lend them money based on, some sort of parameter of their business. Like, oh, trust me, we'll tell you when our business is at a certain point where we'll pay you back. That's ridiculous. But because Beanstalk is a smart contract and it can codify its repayment of the debt based on some parameter, there's no need to make repayment a function of time. And instead of time or an expiry existing on the debt, and the debt being some sort of fungible issuance of debt or semi-fungible issuance of debt, Beanstalk issues pods that are redeemable based on the bean supply, which is something that is enabled by smart contracts. And it's the first in, first out harvest schedule combined with the fact that in practice the temperature doesn't change particularly quickly makes it such that at the margin, if you're thinking about lending to Beanstalk, the cost of someone else lending to Beanstalk before you relative to the marginal benefit of the temperature increasing over the next hour or day a couple percentage points, whereas the temperature right now is over 6,000%. It's marginal benefit for waiting, whereas the risk of someone else lending before you and your expected return or return parameter increasing and therefore your expected value decreasing creates an incentive at the margin to lend to Beanstalk at whatever price you think is an efficient price, or at least in a relatively efficient way. Again, arguably it could be further improved, but that's the general juxtaposition of how Beanstalk issues debt.
Okay. And Guy shared a bit from the Basis white paper that just so that Basis was the protocol that was never launched, but it was the initial, let's say, white paper or the first credit-based stablecoin that was written, and in it the expiration was 5 years. ESD, the expiration of the bonds were around 90 epochs, which was around 30 days. So Publius, first in, first out, who buys first or who gets and holds the bonds first is the first that gets paid out. And then the second important point here is that there is no expiration, or the bonds in that case, or the pods that you hold don't expire. Then when it comes to how the interest rate is calculated, maybe what's of interest is the idea of a death spiral, and by death spiral we mean maybe the interest rate going out of control. So when and previously, as it was a measurement of the debt, so the higher the debt, the higher the interest rate. There is no such thing that's in Beanstalk. So Beanstalk doesn't look at a certain thing, and the more that thing is, the higher the interest rate is. So for example, maybe how far are you from PEG? Then Beanstalk increases the interest rate by a higher rate. the way that Beanstalk increases the temperature, or which is the interest rate, is based on demand for soil. But that increase is limited. It is set. It's either 1 or 3%, irrespective of how big or how long or how far the price of bean is, or how long has it been that there has not been demand there. Is that correct, Publius?
Yeah. So currently, Beanstalk issues soil based on the delta B, so the change in beans from peg generally, and it's slightly different when it's above and below peg. But if Beanstalk needs 100,000 beans to be bought on the market for the price to return to peg, there will be 100,000 soil. Is generally how it works, and the temperature on that soil is changing exclusively at the moment based on the price, or really the delta B over the previous season, what the time and liquidity weighted average delta B over the previous season, whether it was above or below peg, and the debt level of Beanstalk. And the concept is that as the debt level changes, generally, when it's particularly high or particularly low, the change in temperature, should fluctuate in addition to changing based on the price. And there's right now the system is divided into 4 debt levels or pod rate levels, and 2 price levels, above and below peg, and then extremely low, reasonably low or relatively low, relatively high, and extremely high. And the change in temperature is a function of those 2 parameters exclusively. Now, as you were talking about, Mod, there is no notion of time below peg or above peg and time at a certain debt level. And there's also no notion of magnitude in terms of price. And all of those could be potentially incorporated into the change in temperature. And the change in temperature could be changed from some arbitrary value to some relative value of the overall temperature, but that's more likely to have some sort of exponential change, which is probably acceptable on the downside, but not acceptable on the upside, because again, the goal is not to have a runaway temperature that creates a death spiral. So there's a lot of open questions as to what is the optimal set of things to consider in the function that changes the temperature. And there's also a question as to, even if we don't change the inputs, just the right way to consider the current inputs. But currently Beanstalk only changes the temperature linearly, as you said, 1 or 3%, based on the delta B and the pod rate, the debt level.
Okay, so this was taken into account. It was put in design. Once again, the idea of what is the kind of the debt that's issued, which is a FIFO and one that doesn't expire, and then how the temperature is changed. And back then it was the weather. Beanstalk launches, and then there are a set of improvements that happen. And as you said, so initially Beanstalk would issue soil. That soil can be bought for beans, where you sow your beans into the soil, and then you receive pods. And initially, when Beanstalk launched, there was no cap on the amount of soil that's available or issued by Beanstalk. That changed then later, Publius. Can you maybe tell us, why did that happen? What was the experience that that happened, or we the protocol experienced, and then an improvement was introduced?
So there were a couple different BIPs that changed the soil and temperature issuance, but the most notable from a theoretical perspective was that previously there was cumulative soil meaning that Beanstalk, if it was below, if the delta B was negative for a consecutive number of seasons, the soil would accumulate as a sum across multiple seasons up to some maximum percentage relative to the bean supply. And that resulted in a massive amount of soil issuance that was unnecessary to repeg Beanstalk. And so Beanstalk would then be above peg and have lots of soil, which would then lead to a significant amount of debt issuance that was unnecessary. And so there were BIPs, at least one BIP put in place to change the soil issuance, where now it's not cumulative. It's only based on the previous season. And that change in soil issuance resulted in a dramatic decrease in the pod rate, not the pod rate itself, but the change in the pod rate over time. And then ultimately it led to the first decrease in the pod rate. So if you go to the charts on bean.money, you can see, I think it was in, I don't have it in front of me right now, but I think it was in like November of 2021 when that BIP went live, and that was one of the most significant changes in the model. And originally it was thought that there was some lag, or I mean, it was kind of stupid in hindsight, but to steelman the argument, the concept was that if there was some combination of time factored into the soil issuance, so it's not just the magnitude of the current deviation, but it's a time weighted average over a long, or not a time weighted average, a sum over time. Excuse me. The concept is that that would account for not just the current deviation, but some notion of the magnitude of the deviation. But time was clearly in practice not the right value to consider in terms of soil issuance. Now, it may be something to consider on the temperature front, but it was not a good thing to have on the soil issuance front.
Okay, so where we are right now, there is soil available, and as you said, maybe the temperature is not high enough, or there is not enough demand for that soil at the moment. But it's maybe easy to forget that it was not long time ago when Beanstalk was selling out or selling soil that it didn't even need to or necessarily need to. And I think by some accounts, almost half of the debt that's available right now by Beanstalk was issued due when it was unnecessary, or when the price of bean was above 1. And as you said, that was one of the major changes or updates to Beanstalk, that now it only issues the amount of soil that is necessary or that is needed to get back to peg. Publius, I want to talk then about another improvement, and that I believe happened after replant, which is the amount of soil that is now issued depending on the debt level is different, when the price of bean is above 1. And maybe I'll give an example. So let's say Beanstalk would typically issue 100 beans. Now that the price of beans is above 1, if the debt is too high, it would only issue 50 beans. And that has the effect of reducing the pod line instead of maintaining it when the price of bean is above 1. And I think the answer is clear here. Why? And why is because the debt level is high, so Beanstalk would optimize towards also still continue to measure the demand for soil, but also reducing the pod line. Is that correct, Publius?
Yeah, and at this point, there's a further improvement under audit at the moment to implement a Dutch auction in the field, such that the beginning of each season, I believe it'll probably be the first 25 seasons, the first 25 blocks, of each season. There's a Dutch auction such that the temperature is priced up to the current temperature, and that will hopefully also dramatically improve the soil issuance. And there's a lot of open questions as to further improvements that can be made to the temperature, but as you said, there was another improvement on the soil issuance, and these are all marginal changes, and there's a couple things that can probably still be improved.
Okay, and yes, the Dutch auction is expected. Again, that happens when the price is above 1 and we're selling out of soil. But it's easy again to look at where the status is in now and forget, the other side of the coin. I guess when the price is above 1, the challenges, I would say, in issuing that. So the Dutch auction would have hopefully help with two things. First of all, is reduce the amount of that is issued, or optimize on the amount that is sold, and also help with measuring, or more accurately, let's say, measure the demand for that debt. Publius, you touched a little bit about maybe other future improvements. What do you think? What other ideas or things that you think are ways to think more about improving the field?
So again, from a theoretical perspective, in addition to so the two values that Beanstalk currently considers is the delta B and the pod rate, there's a question of magnitude of deviations in terms of time and deviation from the peg. And you can perform as much statistical analysis based on those inputs as you want in theory, and hopefully at some point people do the analysis or the theoretical analysis on what is the theoretical optimal things to measure at the margin. So those are like the theoretical inputs that are worth considering, and we have not really spent the time on that. Don't intend to. There's too much stuff to think about, and that's really only going to be a marginal improvement. And it's unclear if it's something that can be answered anytime in the near future, particularly given the small scale of Beanstalk. So it might just be something that takes a lot of time to get a lot of data on before really all of those factors can be considered. But something that's a simple improvement that could be made in the near future to the field that would likely improve things would be to have some downward reflexivity in the temperature when the system repegs, perhaps if it repegs for a certain period of time, such that in addition to the FIFO incentive, there's also a larger risk at the margin of the interest rate that you'll receive going down, in addition to your place in line going up. So that could potentially create an even more efficient market for soil. But other than that, that's probably, there's also an open question as to whether it makes sense to have one thing we haven't talked about is demand for soil. And I'm sorry for kind of skipping some of this stuff, just have limited time today for class, unfortunately. But the measurement of demand for soil is something that is highly imperfect in a lot of different ways, particularly it's very hard to measure when there has been demand for all of the soil, because as soon as the system defines how it's going to read all of the soil being sown in a season, the lenders can sow just the parameter minus a very small amount, such that it's not worth the gas fee to sow to the parameter that would be considered the maximum soil. And in short, that makes it hard for the system to know whether, in practice, all of the soil has been sown. And so there's some open theoretical question as to how to measure demand for soil. Currently, Beanstalk measures demand for soil in 3 states, and there's an increasing, steady, and decreasing demand for soil. And there's an open question as to whether there's a need for a steady state. And so, in addition to the delta B and the pod rate, in practice, the changes in temperature are a function of the change in demand for soil from season to season. Another thing worth considering is whether or not the change in demand for soil should be based on a time-weighted average over multiple seasons. Currently, it just is from the previous season to the current season, and whether or not there needs to be a steady state or not. So currently, there's 24 different states for temperature changes based on the 3 parameters, and again, that can be generalized into infinite, more of a continuous state as opposed to 24 discrete states. But at the moment, that's probably another place where the system could be refined. And otherwise, that's probably enough potential improvements for the moment, or just commentary on where there's inefficiency, even without solutions.
Okay. And true, as you said, even though we dedicated this class for the field, it feels like we skimmed through a lot of the details, and rightly so. We can spend a lot of time, maybe even multiple classes, just discussing the field. With that, I will pause here and see if the audience have any questions that we can answer regarding the topic of today, or any other question that is before ending this class. Okay. I'd like to remind everyone again that there are 2 channels for discussions of the 2 BIPs that are going to be proposed. The 2 BIPs, one is for Seraph. Seraph is the solution by our auditor that is meant to help secure Beanstalk and is going to be used in governance. And then the other BIP is for the Beanstalk Farms budget. Notably, again, the difference in this budget is that it's going to be for the half of the year, so it's not a quarter of the budget. I encourage everyone again to read through the proposals, join the discussion, and then we have a DAO meeting tomorrow that you can come in and discuss it at length. The team will also hold office hours that they'll be happy to answer any questions about these proposals, and again about anything about Beanstalk in general. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.